Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that we are going with our series on history of English literature, and we are conducting lectures for you so that it becomes easier for you to get in-depth knowledge on the topic, the history of English literature. Dear friends, I would like to tell you all that today in this session we would be talking on the Shakespearean stage, and we would be conducting this session, this lecture in two halves. In first half we would be talking on comedy, and in the second half we would be discussing on the tragedy. So dear friends, I would like to tell you all that for this very discussion we have once again with us within our studios Professor Bhimsen Dahiya. Professor Bhimsen Dahiya has given his immense contribution in the field of academics. He has authored numerous books, as well as he is appreciated, as well as he has a number of students in India and abroad. Dear friends, let's take advantages from his experiences and let's try to get in-depth knowledge on the Shakespearean stage. So without wasting any time, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Bhimsen Dahiya. Professor Dahiya, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. Talking of Shakespeare, he is considered today the greatest dramatist ever born in all the languages of the world, not merely in English, in all the languages. His position as a dramatist remains unchallenged. Those days in the 16th century, when Shakespeare lived and wrote for the stage, even acted, even the dramatists were called poets. So poet would cover the dramatist as well. And then Shakespeare wrote poems too. Some of the poems are very famous, popular even. For example, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. These two poems, written in the Ovidian style, Ovid, was a model for the Renaissance poets, and they copied him. His style was very majestic, very voluptuous, very flowery. Nothing was to be said starkly and straightly. Everything must come through images, must come through live pictures of life. So that is what Shakespeare does in these two poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. Long poems and narrative poems and full of spicy matter which the readers those days liked. But then primarily and predominantly Shakespeare was a dramatist, and he devoted most of his time writing for the stage. He wrote all kinds of plays which were in fashion those days, because you have to cater to the popular taste, popular demand. Theatre is a public place, and it will attract people only if you are offering shows of their interest to their taste. Hence, Shakespeare too, like all other dramatists of his time, wrote whatever was in fashion. In fashion were four types of plays. Most popular was comedy, then tragedy, then histories, and finally romances. And Shakespeare wrote all the four, and in each category several plays. The largest, of course, comes under comedy, second largest tragedy, and then histories, and finally a few romances. So that's the tally of Shakespeare's output as a dramatist. Taking up his comedies, we can say that he wrote popular comedy and not the elitist comedy. There was in vogue in his time the elitist comedy also, which was popularized by the university wits, who were university educated writers, dramatists, and very proud of themselves, and very arrogant at that, because they will detest anyone not having their level of education. That is why Ben Jonson, one of these elitist dramatists, he wrote supposedly in praise of Shakespeare when his plays were collected, put together by two actors who used to play Shakespeare's or stage Shakespeare's plays those days. So in 1623, the first folio of his plays came out, sort of collected work, dramatic work of Shakespeare, and to which was appended a short poem by Ben Jonson, a contemporary and a friend of Shakespeare. But in that supposedly praise poem, Ben Jonson says Shakespeare knew little Latin and less Greek. It is a left-handed compliment. He knew little Latin and less Greek. And those days, if you do not know these two languages and the literature and philosophy or thought in those two languages, Greek or Roman, you were not really considered educated, not an elite. So Shakespeare was not an elite. He was not one of the university wits. So a popular writer knowing little Latin and less Greek. But then, as the critics later realized that this was not really a disadvantage to him. In fact, on the contrary, it proved to be an advantage, because rather than get bound to the rules, get bound to the fixed, inflexible and rigid form of comedy, tragedy, defined by the classical authorities, Shakespeare, as a popular dramatist, had the liberty to make his own forms, to carve out his own dramatic forms of comedy, tragedy, history, romance, whatever. So he had the scope to modify, he had the scope to invent. So, whatever interested him, whatever looked of general interest to him, he wrote about that and wrote freely. Therefore, his dramatic style and his plots and his characters, they do not subscribe to the classical format as it was laid down by, say, Aristotle or Horace, and practiced by poets like Virgil or Homer in epic, long poems, and later in drama by, say, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and so on and so forth during the Roman period. Seneca. So, these were the models. Seneca was the latest model in drama, and whoever was not writing Senecan tragedy, that type, that form was not considered literate enough. That's why Shakespeare was given this uncharitable title of knowing little Latin and less Greek. But then, as I said, this proved to be ultimately an advantage to him, because not bound by any rules, he was at liberty to invent, he was at liberty to go whatever was popular, whatever he thought would be of interest to the general public. And that's why he emerged to be the greatest dramatist of his time, and now, of course, for all times. Dryden had said that very early, just after Shakespeare's time. Dryden comes in the 17th century. Shakespeare was in the 16th. And Dryden says that he was a dramatist greatest for all times, not only for his own age, but even for later ages. So, as early as that, it had been realized that he had the greatest genius of a poet and a dramatist. A poet because the language that he enriched. English was in the formative period those days, and it had limited vocabulary of around 6,000 words. It was he who enriched the language by coining, by creating and recreating new and newer vocabulary for the English language. And it is said that his vocabulary counted for 40,000 words. Imagine writing at a time when the dictionary had total number of 6,000 words, and he, Shakespeare, using 40,000 in his plays, comedies, tragedies, and so on. So, coming to his comedies, as I said, he did not follow the classical model. Therefore, his comedies are of the popular form. As a result, they are loose in plot, because quite often, as Johnson says, he is carried by scenes, events which interest him, and he forgets the plot line. That's why Johnson says a quibble to Shakespeare was his Cleopatra. He lost the world for it and was not sorry to do that. So, like Antony, for Cleopatra he lost the world and he was not sorry for that. Similarly, Shakespeare was all for quibble, the kind of interesting witty dialogue, situations, scenes he would create, and he would forget the plot line. Therefore, there are more digressions in his plots, and his plots are loosely woven together. The incidents are not totally unrelated, but then quite often they are only tangentially related to each other, and yet he emerged as the greatest writer of comedy, not merely in his own time, but for all times. So, what did he do? To begin with, he wrote whatever was in fashion. So, he wrote The Taming of the Shrew. He wrote Love's Labour is Lost. He wrote several other early plays which were merely in tune with whatever was in vogue, whatever was fashionable. The Taming of the Shrew is one such. Similarly, Love's Labour, where you have those three practicing asceticism, and all the three one by one falling for three different women. So their asceticism comes to nothing. Love's Labour is lost. The title tells all that is there in the play. So Shakespeare's comedies, beginning with whatever was fashionable, emerged finally as a much more vital, much more energetic, much more varied, multidimensional, and much more intense, with greater depth than the comedies of his time had. There were a lot of other writers, including these university wits, Marlowe included, Lilly, Green, Peele, all of them were there, but then he excelled them all. And he wrote great comedies like The Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, then Much Ado About Nothing, and so many more. But the best known are these: As You Like It, superb. Then The Merchant of Venice, again superb. And then among the later romances also, you have comedies. Actually, the basic dramatic models are two only: comedy and tragedy. The rest are subspecies. You have romances, you have histories, but then they finally fall in these two categories, either comedies or tragedies. Histories also. Shakespeare wrote a lot of history plays. He covered, in fact, the entire history of England, beginning with King John, in whose time Magna Carta, the Charter of Human Rights, came up. And then, of course, all those Henrys, Henry the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, all these plays he wrote. And then of course Richard II, Richard III, Edward, so on and so forth. So he wrote history plays, he wrote romances like The Tempest, like Pericles, like Winter's Tale, Two Gentlemen of Verona, all these he wrote, but these ultimately become the subspecies of what is generically called comedy and tragedy. So these romances also and histories also, histories which are on the comic side, they will fall within the category of comedy. There are others which will be included under the other category, tragedy. So comedy will include regular comedies, and then the subspecies like romantic comedies or romances, historical comedies or histories. So Shakespeare presents in these plays jest for life, that life is to be enjoyed, life is for fun, life is not to feel miserable, not to weep, not to remain wretched, but to enjoy and to be able to laugh even at yourself. So this is what the message of the comedies comes out in the entire lot of Shakespeare's production. To begin with, as I said, there were conventional comedies like The Taming of the Shrew, and even Measure for Measure, which is a later one. But then it falls within the same framework where you have little revenges taken by the characters upon each other, and their jealousies leading to little mischiefs, and finally getting resolved, because comedy ultimately has to end in resolution, and resolution which is happy ending, otherwise it will not be a comedy. Wherever the resolution is not, wherever the conflict is not resolved, then it will assume the form of tragedy. So in comedy, tensions, conflicts, they are resolved, and resolved happily. So you find very familiar plots like brothers separated, or brother and sister separated, and you begin with a near tragic situation, whether they are searching for each other to no success, and they are meeting with all sorts of difficulties, all sorts of impediments in life. But then gradually things come round to resolution, and finally the happy ending. The separated brothers or brother and sister meet, they find each other, they get together, and then a new life begins, a life of happiness, life of joy, life of living together, a family life. So it is this kind of plot that you find in Shakespeare. Sometimes slightly different kind, like Measure for Measure. In Measure for Measure, there is a female character who is very strict about her purity, about her celibacy, so to say. She is averse to marriage and she has taken a vow not to marry anyone and not to have sexual life and so on, or even family life. So there come trials, there come offers, very tempting also, from the very highest, the Duke. The Duke wants to marry her, he falls in love with her, but then she is adamant not to do it. So finally it has to be resolved comically, otherwise it will take the tragic turn. So ultimately Shakespeare finds a way to get her be persuaded by the Duke, and then the marriage takes place. That's how comedies finally end. Even in The Tempest, which falls under the subspecies or subcategory of romance, what do we have there? We have a father and daughter thrown out of the family, of the town, of the kingdom, so that they are not having to have their legitimate claim of ruling the state. So, at the mercy of fortune, thrown into the river, but then as nature helps them, God helps them, they are rescued. And after going through all the impediments, finally there is the happy ending. They meet and so on. Similarly, Pericles, the lost one, finally is found. So that's how comedies go. And Shakespeare was a master of comedy, a great artist at that, and that's why he continues to be ranked as number one in all the languages, on all these stages. He is staged in different languages, not merely in English, and equally successful in other languages also. Thank you. Well, today we will talk about Shakespearean tragedy. He is known to be the greatest writer of tragedy. in all the languages, not merely English. And many of the titles, many of his tragedies are familiar even to those who do not know any language, because they have watched, they have enjoyed these tragedies staged by famous actors. In fact, a lot of actors made their fortunes right from his own age, from 16th down to the present, these 400 years. There has been a large class of actors who have staged Shakespeare's tragedies, and they made a name for it. Tragedies before Shakespeare were again, like the comedies, modeled on the classical form, following the rules laid down by classical authorities. That was the practice of the university wits who came preceding Shakespeare, just before him, like Marlowe was one. As I said in the case of comedy, Lilly, Green, Peel, they were in comedy. But in tragedy, you have more the Jacobean followers. And the Jacobean tragedy became rather more sensational, where blood for blood, revenge for revenge, that kind of thing. In a way, they made it much more sensational than it was in Shakespeare. Shakespeare, being a serious dramatist, a serious minded artist, he would not go very far away from the realities of life, and he will use moderation to the excesses that were being practiced in his time. So tragedy also, in a way, he both enriched and refined as he had found it. Like Marlowe was his immediate predecessor, but Marlowe was one of the university wits, so he wouldn't deviate from the classical rules. So his Edward II or Dr. Faustus or Tamur Lane, all these plays, they are cut out or cut according to the rules laid down. He wouldn't deviate from the classical form. That is why there the characters do not really come up in their own right. They don't get individualized. They are types. In Shakespeare, each and every character, big or small, royal or from the servant class, each and every one has his or her space, individual space, and known in his or her own right. And we remember them, we talk about them, we glorify them, we laugh with them or weep with them. So here in tragedy, again you have a variety of characters. Of course, it is always the central character, the tragic hero, who is the dominant character, because primarily it is his tragedy and not anyone else's. But then that does not mean the other characters are unimportant. Quite often, the villain, because in tragedy there has to be a villain who will cause the tragedy, who will play some mischief, who will commit some evil to bring about the tragedy. And there are plays in which the villain dominates the scene, even in Shakespeare. Iago, for example, in Othello. Othello is one of his 4 great tragedies, as A.C. Bradley chooses and makes the choice famous. The Shakespearean tragedy. He writes about only the 4 great ones. So Othello is one of them. And in Othello, Othello's character is not as glamorous, not as catchy, not as powerful as that of Iago, who is a villain. And most of the time on the stage, you see Iago, because it is he who is engineering things. So the plot moves as he wishes it to move. And Othello is more of a passive character, and he acts only in the crucial moments. But then the action has been manipulated, action has been defined and given as a sort of role by the villain Iago. So in tragedy, it is not just the tragic hero. The villain is equally important. Similarly, in King Lear, you have the king himself, the tragic hero, who is deprived by his own daughters of everything that he had, his kingdom, his estate, his house, his property, his servants, everything, and he is turned out of the house as a beggar. And on the heath, he is a beggar. But then he has 3 daughters, and out of those 3, 2 turn out to be treacherous. They become hostile and they become oppressive, and he suffers under their oppression. But at the same time, there is the 3rd daughter who proves angelic, who proves his stay in life, and it is she who rescues him from the tragic death, and in his last years and moments, it is she who sustains him through her love. But then it is the same daughter whom he had deprived of everything due to her. She is like a mad king, full of power, full of vanity, and he thinks he could do anything. So one day he says, all right, I will divide all my property among my daughters, 3 daughters. So he calls them and asks each one of them to say things in his praise. The 2 tell all sorts of lies, Goneril and Regan, and they flatter him, and he feels very happy. The 3rd one, being a gentle daughter, being an honest daughter, a truthful one. She refuses to say things which she knows are false. In other words, she refuses to tell lies, and therefore she says nothing. King asks him, "Do you have anything to say?" She says nothing. And then, out of anger, he retorts, he says, "Nothing will come out of nothing," which means she is deprived of all property, all her share in the estate which the king had, and he gives everything to his two daughters. But then, after giving everything, he makes himself a beggar. Now he lives at the mercy of those two daughters. And then they say he can live 15 days with one and 15 days with another in the month. But then, king as he was, he must have an army of servants to look after him. But then very soon the daughters tell him, "Look here, you are no longer the king. You are not even the master of the house, and we cannot afford your army of servants. Therefore, reduce it from 20 to 15 to 10 to 5, and finally no servant, no help." So he is turned out as a beggar. And when he is turned out as a beggar, it is the third daughter who finally comes to his rescue. It is she who takes him along, who gives him life, who sustains him in his last moments. So that is how the story goes. Similarly, in Hamlet, incidentally, all this happens because of the engineering of a villain. The real villain is not these two daughters, but there is Edmund. He is the villain, and he is playing upon both, giving them false promises, sometimes of marrying one and sometimes marrying the other, and finally cheats both. He appropriates their properties and runs away with it, doesn't marry either of them. So he is the real villain. And who is he? He is the bastard son of Gloucester, next to the king. So Gloucester has one legitimate son, Edgar, and one, this illegitimate one, this bastard Edmund. So Edmund shows his colors and ruins finally his own father, his own brother, and he reduces Edgar again to a beggar. So father and son both made beggars. Similarly, Lear's daughters make Lear a beggar. And in the final scenes of the play, these two beggars meet. They are together on the heath. And then the sisters and these brothers, their husbands, they fall out. And then there is a war between them and kill each other. That is how tragedies take place. So what the villains do is destroy the good destroy the heroes, but in the process they also destroy themselves. So that is the great lesson of tragedy, that evil has the potential to destroy good, but at the same time evil finally will destroy itself also, because its nature is destructive, and destruction it must cause. If no one else is around, then it will cause that destruction to itself. So that is what happens in King Lear. That is what happens in Othello. In Othello, we have Iago, who engineers everything like Edmund does in King Lear, and he creates a misunderstanding between husband and wife. He uses a third person, innocent one, sends him to Othello's house, and then poisons Othello's ears, saying that he has illicit relations with Othello's wife, Desdemona. And he plays upon this weakness of Othello, finally succeeding in causing this tragedy, because the misunderstanding reaches a point where Othello strangulates his wife, kills her, and then Iago's wife, the villain's wife, she knew the whole truth, Amelia, and she cannot, conceal that truth from Desdemona, despite her husband's warnings, threats. She gives out the truth. That is the quality of a good character. That is the sign of a good character, that whatever the threat, whatever the oppression, whatever the torture, its commitment to truth is total and unshakable. So here also in Othello, the truth then finally comes out, and Amelia reveals the truth. The villain's own wife, she reveals the truth to Othello, telling him, "You fool, you killed an angel, you killed a fairy, you killed the most innocent, pure woman." Once he comes to know that, then he doesn't know how to continue living. So he ends his own life. He kills himself, because now it's a judgment on himself, that a person with that fallibilities, that follies, has no right to continue living, and therefore he takes his own life. Another great tragedy, Hamlet. The greatest, in fact, may not be in terms of plotting, may not be in terms of following the rules of tragedy, sorry, but then in terms of the hero, Hamlet himself, the tragic hero that Shakespeare created, it remains unbeatable. The most fascinating tragic hero ever created by any dramatist in any language. That is why Hamlet continues to be so popular, translated in all languages, played on all stages. Even the tribals do that. Our own Heather, or the latest version, that is an adaptation. So adaptations, appropriations, reappropriations, translations go on. We have n number of these plays where Hamlet is presented in so many forms, in so many facets. So here again there is a domestic tragedy. Of course, since Shakespeare wrote about kings and princes, because those were the times when there was no democracy like we have today, where there are no kings and princes. At that time, rulers were these royal families. So obviously, it may be tragedy or it may be comedy. The story had to be about them. So Hamlet too is a prince. But then, as the intrigues go with power, because everybody wants to grab power, rightly or wrongly, hence intrigue will come about, murders will take place, treacheries will be committed by your own kith and kin, your own near ones. That is precisely what happens here. Hamlet has an uncle, Claudius, and he has his mother, Gertrude, and he had his father, Hamlet. His name too was Hamlet, Senior Hamlet. So what happens in the family is that his mother develops illicit relations with his uncle, Claudius. Sorry. And as a result, finally, the lovers want to eliminate the legitimate husband, which is Senior Hamlet. So when he was asleep one night, he is poisoned in the ear and therefore eliminated. What we have in the play is the ghost of Senior Hamlet. And the ghost scenes are very powerful. The play in fact opens with the ghost scene where Hamlet's friend Horatio and others, those on duty, the armed constables, they see this ghost, but the ghost refuses to talk to any one of them. It disappears. Then Horatio, a friend of Hamlet, he suggests to Hamlet that you approach the ghost perhaps in isolation. When you are alone with the ghost will speak to you. So Hamlet follows the ghost, and the ghost takes him into a corner, and in that corner he reveals the truth, how he was murdered by his own younger brother and wife. And this revelation upsets Hamlet so much that he loses his wits, becomes almost mad. And he is all the time out to find Claudius, to kill him, to take revenge for his father's murder. So in a way, it's a tragedy of revenge. It's a revenge tragedy. And in fact, it was written by someone else also before Shakespeare. Shakespeare borrows the plot from him, but then nobody would care to read the earlier versions of Hamlet. So when Claudius sees the danger in Hamlet that is out to take revenge, he arranges to send him outside the country. They belong to Denmark. So he sends him to England. But then Hamlet plays a trick. When he is being carried in a ship to England, he comes upon the letters which Claudius had addressed to these people, what to do with them after reaching England. So what he does is he changes the text of the letter, and rather than sending himself or being or getting killed by those people, he writes that these people are to be killed. So his killers finally get killed. So he comes back, returns, and then he finds that there is somebody's coffin placed there, and there are the grave diggers. Then he asks the grave diggers, whose coffin is it? Then they tell him, this is Ophelia. He gets the shock of his life, because Ophelia he loved. She was the daughter of Apollonius, the secretary to the king, and he had his son also, Laertes. Then he asks the gravedigger, what happened to her? Why was she killed? He said, no, she was not killed, she killed herself. And she killed herself because she was betrayed in love. Then he says, by whom? Then he names him. He says, by Hamlet. So, where is Hamlet? Gone to England. Why there? Because everybody there is like him, mad. That's how the whole thing goes. And we stop here about Shakespeare's tragedy. Enough for the day. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. And dear friends, we hope that you have liked this lecture. For accessing this lecture the number of times you wanted, very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you, and we would be meeting again tomorrow and would be discussing on another topic under the series, the history of English literature. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.